We are live on the internet from the Port Washington Public Library. All right. Program is called Inside the Musician's Mind. I want to welcome everyone to this one of this month's installments. We're doing two this month. Format is loosely based on something called Inside the Actor's Studio. I'm sure you're familiar with it. With a nod at the end of the questionnaires of James Lipton and Bernard Pafot and Marcel Proust. On a personal level, I sort of approach things as my dear friend and mentor, Pete Fornatel, did. I hope we do them both justice with the program we do here. As a lifelong music enthusiast, collector, historian, I often wonder what makes my favorite musicians, arrangers, composers, and lyricists tick. Why do they do what they do? How do they best do what they do? Basically, what goes on inside the musician's mind. I want to venture into places that I know will be interesting, fascinating, and possibly a bit unusual. I also plan to, every episode, take you all along with me to do this. So without further ado, let me begin with a little background on today's guest. I'm going to jump pages here. This afternoon, we will be joined by a gentleman who holds the Billboard magazine record for music arranger with more top 10 hits than anyone in the history of pop music. He has recorded and had hit records with some relatively unknown artists like, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, Neil Diamond, Barbra Streisand, Glenn Campbell, Engelbert Humperdinck, Juice Newton, Lou Christie, Ronnie Millsap, Bruce Springsteen, a young fellow named Frank Sinatra, Eric Carmen, Roberto Carlos, many, many more. His music has been nominated for 15 Grammys. He's a Jersey boy. He's a former member of the Four Seasons. He is an inductee into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame, and a composer, a producer, an arranger, an accomplished author. Will you please give a warm welcome to today's guest, Mr. Charles Calello. Going on this one. All right. So, I'll take that and toward me here a little bit. As I always do in this program, we're going to start with some questions that might provide our audience with some insight to kind of how and why you've come to do what you do. So we're going to sort of start going way back, if that's okay.
Okay. Actually, I started because my father was a musician. And he was a club date musician. He played weddings, bar mitzvahs, and parties. My father was a very good sight reader, and he was a very polished musician doing that kind of work. And it used to upset him that the accordion players would always make more money because they would come and play a little earlier at the jobs. So he influenced me to become an accordion player.
Wow.
Yeah, so as an Italian, the first thing you do is you say, oh, well, this is my heritage. I should follow through. But I really hated the accordion. I mean, with a passion, I hated it. But one of the things that happened is, as a result of playing the accordion, I was able to develop a sense of chords. So I got to understand harmony and things like that.
Sure. You were obviously then surrounded by music at home.
Yes.
What was the first piece of music that you recall that really struck you that made you say, I'm not just going to be passive about this. I'm not going to listen. I want to play. Do you remember what the first things were that really hit you that way?
That's a really good question. I could think back that the first record that I ever heard on a radio that actually inspired me to start to pay attention to listening to music was Johnny Ray's Cry. And I wrote an arrangement for Ronnie Millsap on that quite a few years ago. And that's one of my favorite arrangements that I've ever written, is that arrangement on Cry.
So it was nice because it came back all the way back around for you again. That's a nice thing to have happen. Would you say that your father was one of the big influences on you as a musician? Were there musicians, and obviously too, as you went on to become a composer, an arranger, were there arrangers that you paid attention to?
Well, the first record that I noticed an arranger on was Miles Davis' Move. Once I started to listen to music, I found out my father had a record collection. And because he was a trumpet player, he had Miles Davis records. So I looked on the record and I saw that Jerry Mulligan wrote the arrangement. Then I looked and I studied the musicians that were actually on this record that were, I didn't know at the time, they were studio musicians. And then later on, listening to Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole and those kinds of records, I recognized that Nelson Riddle was an arranger. And then listening to jazz and listening to Count Basie's band and Stan Kenton's band to learn that there were arrangers that actually wrote that.
Yeah.
But the thought of me becoming an arranger didn't enter my head at that time.
So it started as a performer. I mentioned earlier that you hail from New Jersey.
Yep.
What do you remember about your first meetings with the members of a group called the Four Lovers? How did that come to pass?
After I graduated high school, I was working in a place off of Bloomfield Avenue in New Jersey. It was, I think it was still Newark. Yeah, it was in Newark. And I was working at a club called the Venetian. And we had sort of a highbrow band. Now, when I was 18 years old, I didn't understand about commercialism or what brought an audience into a club or anything like that. We just played music we wanted to play. So we were doing very sophisticated music, and naturally the musicians in town loved us, but we couldn't draw 6 people. But one night, in walks Frankie Valli. So he walks in, and everybody in the place knew who Frankie was. In 1956, he had a hit record called You're the Apple of My Eye with the group The Four Lovers.
Right.
And by 1958, when this was, when I met him, he was one of the biggest draws in the area working clubs. And he heard that we sang like the Four Freshmen. And being music students, because I went to a music and arts high school, being music students, all the fellows that we had in the band were accomplished musicians. And most of the people that played in these local bands were sort of what we call triad musicians. They weren't really sophisticated, but they could play by ear and they could sing and they could entertain. But we were sort of like the real deal in town. So Frankie walked in and he walked around a stage. He tried to find out where the sound was coming from. And then he asked one of the guys in the band, he says, who wrote these arrangements? They said, the fellow over there. So he walked over, he says, hi, I'm Frankie Valli. She says, you write these arrangements? I said, yeah. So we went on and did a couple more sets. He stayed the whole night. And at the end of the night, Frankie and I hung out until about 4 in the morning. And he says, hey, we got to get together. You got to come and hear my band. You got to hear what we do. That's basically how I met him.
Now you stayed with the Four Lovers through the transition. The Four Lovers became the Four Seasons, and were you were still on board with the Four Seasons, performing live with the guys and going out and doing live shows, et cetera, at that time?
Well, I left the band I was with because Frankie offered me a job. The Four Lovers consisted of Frankie, Tom Hooch, My Gooch, and also Hank Majeski. My Gooch and Tommy were brothers. So Nicky was the bass player, and when I was in high school, in order for me to be able to be in the orchestra, I had to study another instrument because they didn't have any music for accordions.
Right.
So I studied bass, and I became a bass player. So he asked me if I wanted to join the band. And I gave notice with the other band because they wanted to travel, and I wanted to stay locally so that I could go to school. So I joined the Four Lovers, and I was with the Four Lovers for about a year. And then I wanted to go travel during one summer, and they wanted to stay home, so I went back with the original band.
Okay.
And from there, Frankie, we made a record when I was with the Four Lovers. And once I left, then Bob Gaudio joined the band. And they also made a couple of records. And Frankie went to try to sell the records. He ran into Bob Crew. And Bob Crew hired Frankie and his band to make records for him in New York. Now they need an arranger. So here's Charlie on the road, and they says, you know what, we got to get Charlie to come back. So I started to write arrangements for the Crew while we were making records for Bob Crew.
Right, right. Now, some members of our audience will know and will be aware of it, but can you explain to an audience that's familiar with so many of the songs exactly what an arranger does, exactly what your role was in so many songs? But
Well, what's interesting about songwriters vary in their ability to be able to present a song so that it's acceptable to the public. For example, Irving Berlin played piano, and he could only play in one key. And he had a piano. He would move these pedals, and the inside of the piano would move. And he could demonstrate his songs. He could play them on a piano. But somebody had to take the song and then write it out so that musicians could play it.
Right.
So what would happen is when I was a kid, I was 15 years old, I realized that somebody had to do this. And I started by taking dictation off of records. And then I learned that there were actually arrangers that would put this stuff together. And I started to listen to the arrangers and copy the records. I'd sit there and I'd listen to the first trumpet part, the saxophone part, the string part. So I learned that these arrangers actually had control over how the record would sound, how the singers would sing it, and what would make it exciting for the audience, because they would lay the bed. It's sort of like, picture an arranger as being a piano player that has all of these instruments to work with. He sets, he plays it, and does it exactly the way he hears it in his head. Sorry, guys. That's basically what an arranger does. So he writes out all of the notes for the bass player, the keyboard player, the guitar, the trumpets, the trombones, the tubas, whatever it is that you're going to use, he writes it out.
And there's also a degree of augmentation that goes on too. You and I were talking a little bit before we started the event about the fact that sometimes you will add a signature, something that would become a signature to a song. We were talking about Neil Diamond in particular earlier.
The bum, bum, bum.
And let the audience know what that was.
Well, I wrote the arrangement to Sweet Caroline, so everybody knows that the song starts with boo-ba-doo, boo-ba-doo-ba-doo, boo-ba-doo. Then you get to Sweet Caroline. There you go. So somebody had to write it.
Yeah.
And you know how hard it was? Took about 4 seconds. I wrote bum, bum, bum.
And one of the most popular sort of musical signatures, in Neil Diamond's catalog, probably.
Well, it's probably
Those couple of notes.
Probably the three most famous notes that I wrote. I must have written a couple of million notes in my lifetime, and people remember those three.
Now, when you working with the Four Seasons, do you remember the very first hit song of the Seasons that you arranged? And what was that feeling like for a guy who had been out on the road, working in the clubs? Now all of a sudden there's that song being played on the radio, that first big hit. Do you remember which one was the first one that really?
Walk Like a Man.
Yeah.
While I was on the road, the Four Seasons cut Sherry and Big Girls. And I was in Milwaukee on the road with the band, and I heard Sherry on the radio. And I heard it while I was walking in a park. And I said, boy, that sounds like Frankie. So I got back to the hotel. I called him. I said, Frankie, I just heard a record. Somebody sounds really like... I said, don't tell me it's you. He said, you got a hit record? He says, yeah, it's number one. He says, when are you coming back here? We got to make records. So I said to him, well, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. And he said, great. He says, He says, you can't believe what's going on. So I went back to New Jersey, and I was working in Atlantic City. In order for me to make the rehearsals in New Jersey, at 2 o'clock in the morning, we'd finish. I'd get in a car with the drummer. I'd sleep going up, and then 5 o'clock, we'd turn around and come back so we could be on stage at 9 o'clock. Well, I did that for a week while I came up for the rehearsals.
Wow.
And we rehearsed all the songs that we did in the Big Girls Don't Cry album, and one of them was Walk Like a Man.
Okay.
But the experience of going into the studio for the first time, making a record with people that were not my friends but musicians that I had never met, was an intimidating experience.
Sure. Sure.
Especially knowing that these people that were sitting and holding those instruments had played on numerous hit records. Yeah. And here I am in the studio. I was, I guess at that point, 23 years old, and doing something that was actually became a passion. I really loved writing at that point. It became a passion of mine, and here I was writing and working with great musicians.
Amazing. And probably people who had played on records that you had been listening to growing up, I imagine.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's how I would find out who to hire, was
Right.
by reading the credits off of the records.
So something else really that an arranger does differently, in a way, someone who's a composer, songwriter may not be looking at those musician credits, whereas an arranger, producer, you're making note of everything that's going on in that respect.
Usually what an arranger does is he sets the bed. Normally, the first thing that you hear when you listen to a record, the arranger writes. For example, My Eyes Adored You, do 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 doom beam boom 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 do ba doom beam boom boom dum. So you write all those things after the lovin'. These are all the things that the arrangers bring to the table that set the bed for the artist to start to sing. And all the hit records have some form of an introduction that had to catch the listener's ear to draw them into listening to the song.
One thing that struck me that I had brought up to you was the beginning of Let's Hang On, that powerful opening that comes in before the electric guitar even hits.
Well, actually, when we did Let's Hang On, Bob, the instructions that I got from Bob Crew, I walked into the office and he was writing with Sandy Lynn, Denny Randall, and Bob Crew. Now, Sandy, I found when he was 20 years old as a writer, and I brought him into the fold. And they were pounding away playing Let's Hang On the piano. So I said, that sounds like a hit. So Bob says, we're going to cut it with the Four Seasons. So he said, we're going to make the record, and I want to do it in 2 days. So I said, boy, that's great. He says, I want it to sound like a Rolling Stones Motown record.
Well,
okay?
Okay.
Now, this is the kind of direction that we would get as an arranger. Rock and roll version of Motown, sort of, okay. So Satisfaction had the down, down, there, there. So I wrote down, do, 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 down. I wrote that as the intro. Yeah. And now we made the record, and I wrote all the vocal parts out. Then one of the Denny Randall, who co-wrote the song with Bob and Sandy, went and taught them the vocal parts. They came in and recorded the vocals. Now, Bob, during this time, said, we need an intro. So Bob wrote, and I wasn't a part of this, Bob wrote, there ain't no good in there goodbye, and true love takes a lot. And Tommy went looking in the studio for guitar, and he just added the chords to it. So they laid out that little bed, and then from that point on, it was me.
You hit in with that lead guitar part that was just absolutely. But you also end up, even in a vocal, a band that's so strong on vocals like the Four Seasons, you also are involved in the vocal arranging aspect. And Frankie Valli had a little bit of a hesitancy with his approach to Let's Hang On. That you helped change.
Well, what would take place is Frankie's is a really great singer.
Absolutely.
When somebody once asked, I'll get around to answering that question, but somebody once asked, what's the difference between a great artist and a great singer? Well, we've all gone to weddings or bar mitzvahs, and we've listened to the singers and say, oh, that one, boy, she sounds just like Barbra Streisand, or she sounds just like Celine Dion, or he sounds just like... The thing about a great singer could sing anything and make it sound good. A great artist makes it sound like him.
Mm.
Frankie made everything sound like him. So his tendency was to phrase things differently. But yet us being a pop band, we recognized that you want to sing pop music, you got to sing it so that it's a lot cornier. So we would get Frankie to sing right on the beat. And Frankie would sort of see how far he can get away from singing it on the beat. and it was challenging, but you know, when you have a singer like Frankie Valli that adds his voice to one of your records.
Right. What more could you ask?
Yeah, exactly.
For? Right. Now, you did a lot of incredible work during a time when there was really so much great music on the charts. Songwriters like Lennon and McCartney, they will, for example, cite writers like Brian Wilson as being like friendly competition. They look to see sort of what they were up to. During your career, were you paying attention to what some of the other artists, the other composers and arrangers were doing? Were there any folks that were sort of your friendly competition that you watched and saw what they were doing and learned from one another, and also there was that, you know, push and pull in the charts?
Well, in the 60s, it was a little bit different because there was a consistency with the type of records that we made. And naturally, if there was a hit, I'd buy the record, I'd listen to it, I'd analyze it. And there would be things on the record I'd say, hey, I can use this if I were to make this kind of record. I'd find things in it that I could use, but it's not like I would be trying to copy
Sure.
or do something like that would imitate somebody else's records.
Right.
But
right.
we would basically use ingredients that were very, very similar in nature. Plus, making records, we basically used almost the same musicians. So it was a question of how you arranged the parts to get your records to sound different.
We're also familiar with the term, or we became familiar with the term, the Wrecking Crew, because of Hal Blaine, but there was also a New York and East Coast stable of musicians, weren't there? The guys who were frequently used for recording sessions.
The drummer on a Four Seasons record was Buddy Salzman. Buddy just had a certain feel. And I was explaining earlier today the difference between the energy that went into a record. In many cases, you'd listen to a record and it would have an edge on it that just felt like it was right on top of you. And the musicians that were not schooled, in order for them to perform and make a track, they had to concentrate and use all their energy to get through that record. But more accomplished musicians, this would be very simple for them to do, so it would lack the energy. Mm. So to find musicians that had the ability to play up here, but also had the ability to get the gut that needed that energy down below, that was difficult. Buddy was one of those players. And there were a bunch of musicians back then, Al Gorgoni, Vinnie Bell, that we used on most of the records.
Yeah.
That were part of making Four Seasons records.
Now, if you were to sort of look at your work from that period, are there, and I use the term signature as being some of the things that we hear in a record that we pick up on, that becomes the earworm. Are there things that are Charles Calello's? There are signature things that you feel were part of those early arrangements, that were things that you thought, oh, I could put this in right here, and this is adding your mark as something that was a trait for you that went into the work?
When we started to make the records, myself and Bob Gaudio would sit and write the arrangements. And Bob, as a composer, um, even some of the people that made the Four Seasons records recognized Bob as being like bordered on being a genius for what he was able to accomplish. So Gaudio had specific ideas on how he wanted his records to sound. So he would say, okay, Charlie, I want this to take place, and I'd write it down. And I want this to take, I'd say, okay, Bob, but if you did this, we would have to do that. Oh, okay, let's do that. So we collaborated on the first couple of records. And after we collaborated, and I sort of got a sense of what he was looking for, when it came time to do Dawn Go Away, that was the first time I actually felt that I made a Calello record. They originally wrote it as a folk song.
Wow.
It was written very folky, and when Bob played it for me, he played it as a folky kind of record. Now, prior to the get-together that I had with Gaudio to hear the songs, just only a couple of days earlier, I was going to Bob Crew's office, and Frankie was walking up to the office, and back then you could park on 60th Street without them towing you. So I had a parking space, and Frankie came up to the car, and he says, "Hey man, you going? What's that you're listening to?" And the record More was on, the Mondokani song with Kai Winding, and he heard them playing dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum, and he says, "We got to make a record with that rhythm." So now, when they played me Dawn, I listened to it, and I said, "Give me a few minutes with this." So I had written out a chord sheet, and I worked on it, and I came up with the figure dun 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 dun, and I came up with the bells and the things like this, which became a signature on the Four Seasons records. Many of the records that they made after that used that particular figure. Then also, the next major change was trying to get them to have more of an R&B bottom when we did Let's Hang On, Working My Way Back to You, and the record started to have just a little bit more of an R&B feel.
Sure, sure.
And my father played on Big Girls Don't Cry, played the trumpet solo.
Oh, wow.
He played on The Name Game for me.
Wow.
He played on Let's Hang On, Working My Way Back to You,
What
and
fun.
several other records.
That was great. So you were able to bring your dad, who had been such an influence for you,
Yeah.
into the studio to work with you. That's a blast. When do we think of arrangements, and a songwriter finishes a song, he says, "I'm done." He goes and he tweaks a little bit, fixes a word here, fixes a word there. For you, because so much is involved when you do an arrangement of what it sounds like in the finished product, what it sounds like in the recording, when are you finished in your head? When are you done? You've written it all out. You've said, this is going to work. Is there tweaking in the studio, or is sort of 9 times out of 10 when you finish that arrangement, you put it down, you know, that's it, we're done, this is good?
For me, it was finished when I heard it on the radio. But I will tell. There's a funny story about that. Sandy Lynn and I made a lot of records. We did Lover's Concerto. He wrote Dawn Go Away, Let's Hang On, Working My Way Back to You. And later on, we cut the song Native New Yorker. And the record was released. It was being played on the R&B station here in New York. Sandy heard it on the radio. He pulled the record, went back in the studio and remixed it.
Wow.
And then re-released the record.
Wow.
There was so when you talk about finishing a record, I listened to records on the radio and I said, I should have done, if I only why didn't I hear that? I still go through that today.
You took my next question. That's exactly what I was going to say. It must be, of everything that you've done from that period, are there certain pieces, you can't pick a favorite child, I know that, but there's certain pieces where you look, and hearing it even years later, you go, oh, that was it. We nailed it.
Recently, I listened to a record I made in 1968. It was Laura Nero's Eli and the 13th Confession. I listened to the record, and as I'm listening to it, I'm saying to myself, how did I write that? Oh, I'm listening to the music knowing that I was in the studio. I was there. I know I penciled it out, but what was in my, I couldn't figure it out myself.
Amazing.
It's just that music, as if you're doing it as a living like I did it, you wait for them to talk to you. I can't really explain that, but the music will tell me what it needs. It'll be like, Charlie, it needs this. And then I go searching my brain to see how I can get it to do that.
And obviously different collaborators will inspire in different ways.
Well, I got called to write the strings on Jungle Land for Bruce Springsteen. And I went to the studio to meet Bruce, and they gave me a cassette. And I listened to it in the studio, and I really didn't pay that much attention to it because I had another session I had to go to. So a string arrangement normally would take me maybe 2 hours to write, maybe 3 hours if it was a little more difficult. So I went home at the night before we were going to do the session, and I started to put Jungle Land on. The first thing I would do when I would work at that point with a tape was I'd make a sketch of the whole outline of the song. As I'm listening to the song, now I'm starting to listen to the song. I'm saying to myself, wow, this thing is really, really pretty amazing. I'm thinking, what is this going to need as far as strings? It took me from 11 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning to figure out what the record wanted.
Wow.
And finally I finished it, and when I finished it, I knew that what I wrote was right. And then I wrote the other arrangement in an hour because I had a 10 o'clock meeting I had to be at. So but the interesting part about it, when you go to start to think about how you put these things together, they sort of eventually tell you what they want.
Yeah, yeah. We've been talking about some of the artists that you've worked with. I read a laundry list earlier. So I'm going to just throw some names out to you. I'm going to just ask you the first thing that comes to mind about each of these artists. A few of them we've talked about already. And if you could think of your favorite piece of music that you worked on with them. I'm going to start with the inevitable. I'll start with Frankie Valli.
Don't Go Away.
Okay.
I like the arrangement I wrote on My Eyes Adored You. Also like the arrangement I wrote on Swearing to God. Some of the Four Seasons records, I think, other than Dawn, Working My Way Back to You, Let's Hang On. I liked the arrangement of Working My Way Back to You. I didn't like the recording. I thought the recording could have been better.
Interesting. And that's something, too. I mean, you also put in a lot of work to do the arrangements, and then if you are not producing a session, you're obviously leaving your completed work in the hands of the producer. That can obviously sway things either way and create a hit record from it or not.
Well, it was one of the only records that I made that Buddy Salzman didn't play drums on. And it felt different to me. Sure. And plus, it was the only Four Seasons record that I sang on.
Oh, wow.
Because when I became a Four Season for about a year.
Okay. Out on the road touring with them as well?
Yeah. Nicky left the group, and I got a call from Tom. I cut the track to Lightning Strikes the night that Tommy called me and said to me, Charlie, we need you to come out to meet us because Nicky quit the band.
Okay.
So I said to him, Tommy, I'm in the studio making records. He says, no, we need you. So from We Need You, I wound up becoming a Four Season.
Which, like, again, went around because Nicky replaced you really in the Four Lovers in a way as the bass player.
right.
So you came in and took place when Nicky was gone for
Yeah.
a while. Moving on to Barbra Streisand.
Ah, Barbara was a delight. I got to tell you, I was a bit concerned because people said that she had a very bad reputation with what she would do with music people. When I met her and I started to work on the record, I found her to be she was a motivating factor. You can't believe the energy that came off of her. And she sat next to me as I played the piano. The record we made was My Heart Belongs to Me, which was her first top 5 record that didn't come from a motion picture. The song was written by Alan Gordon, who wrote Happy Together for the Turtles. So he was already an accomplished composer. Now, as I was playing the piano and I'm listening to Barbara sing and playing the part, I actually made the record that we wound up recording with her sitting here and me playing piano, and I just orchestrated what we played.
Oh, wow.
She just drew everything together.
Wow.
And what was exciting about working with her, I went into the studio at 7 o'clock at night to cut 4 songs. 4 o'clock in the morning, she was going, we need one more take. Let's just get one more. She worked harder than anybody in the studio. Wow. She was, boy, on top of her game all the time.
And again, that's a brilliant way that the artist is inspiring the arrangement. As you said, what she gave back to you, just sitting there at the piano with the two of you, helped you put the arrangement together.
Well, it was funny. I was in California at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I had a keyboard there, and I had the rehearsal. I went to the Beverly Hills Hotel, and I started to write the arrangement. And as I'm writing the notes, it's almost like she was over my shoulder pushing the pen, and then she'd call, Charlie, how are the strings? I want the strings to be gorgeous. They should be gorgeous, Charlie. And she was, and then she would call, as I'm writing, you could see that she was motivating. She was doing what she did. Finally, I said to the receptionist, I said, if Barbara calls again, tell her I'm not answering because I got to finish these arrangements. But she says, I can't do that to Miss Streisand.
It also shows that she was passionately involved in the making of her records, which is wonderful.
Then I made another record with her that was #1 in England.
Okay.
It was a record. It wasn't released here. It was I Ain't Gonna Cry Tonight, and Alan wrote that song too. I sort of made an ELO record with her.
Oh wow!
It was a really cool record. Every now and then it'll pop up when I go to the car and I listen through the Bluetooth. It'll pop up and I listen to the record. And I said, boy, I was wishing that record would have been released in the States. It was such a cool record.
I'm sort of trying to imagine a Streisand ELO type thing. And
Well,
that's really interesting.
the ELO thing with the orchestra, with the strings playing that, all those rock, was really a fun record to make.
I can imagine, yeah. Well, we mentioned him earlier with those magic 3 notes. Neil Diamond.
Neil was I only recorded him once. 50 years ago this November.
Yeah, wow.
We did Sweet Caroline. And he's very, to me, I remember him as being very quiet. And when I finished the record, I walked into the control room, and me, as a writer, I'm very passionate about what I write. So I want to hear it, and I want to see how it moves me when I'm in the studio. I went into the control room, and I said, "How was that, Neil?" He says, "Well, I didn't hear anything wrong with it." So I later learned that was, it's terrific.
That was high praise. From Neil Diamond.
Yeah, exactly. But what was really interesting about the song, when it was released, it was just like another record.
Yeah.
No one knew that it would stand the test of time, and it would actually become as bad. I mean, 50 years ago, who would have thunk?
Yeah. As I tell people, I do a 1969 presentation. I always say, if you've ever been to a wedding, if you've ever been to any function, this song is going to be played. It's a never fail. Um, we mentioned her briefly, and a brilliant songwriter, Laura Nero.
Uh, I was called to make Laura's first record, and for some reason, after I met her, they went with another arranger. And I listened to her songs. I thought she was brilliant. And when I got to Columbia Records, I was a little disappointed being at Columbia because of the machine.
Yeah.
The machine was going from being an old traditional record company, moving into the pop business. And one night, before I went home, I went into Clive Davis's office, and I said, Clive, I said, I don't feel like I'm being utilized here. So he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, the company signs artists, and some of the artists that I know that I could work with as a writer, I don't see them, they're not coming into my camp. So he said, I just had a meeting with her manager, David Geffen, and maybe I should put you together with David because I just signed Laura Nero. So I said, oh, I wanted to do her first record. So next day I called David, he called me back, and he set up a meeting for me to go meet Laura. Laura was living on 8th Avenue and 52nd Street. I went to her apartment about 7 o'clock one night, walked up the stairs, and David met me, and I walked in, and Laura was in a one-room apartment. And there were candles lit in the room, and it was very, very, it was minimalistic, to say the least. And we spoke about the record, and he says, Laura would like to play this for you. And I sat there in the room, and she played me the entire Eli record from song 1 all the way to song 13, sitting there, me, David Geffen, and Laura in this room, and I could not believe what I heard. And the record I made eventually got me fired. The Eli record got me fired from Columbia. She was auditioning for producers.
Okay.
So I met with her, and I couldn't believe the similarities that existed. Her father played trumpet. My father played trumpet. She was misunderstood as a kid. I was misunderstood as a kid, being, where my head was at. And we had very similar backgrounds. And our tastes were the same. She loved R&B. She loved Birdland. She loved jazz. She loved Motown. She loved everything. It seemed like we had this mutual love for the same kind of music. And I got the opportunity to work on the record. And as I was making the record, I knew that I was making something that would stand the test of time. Now, I couldn't figure out what it was going to be or how it was going to work out. But I knew that when I finished the record, that it was the best piece of music that I had ever made. This was about 1968. And I finished the record. I said to David, David was working in the mailroom at William Morris. He made the deal at Columbia Records for her while he was working in a mailroom. Right, brilliant man.
Amazing.
So what was really cool about it was I said to him, since her last record, the trades have not didn't know what was going on with her. So we should have a playback party. And back then, I don't think they had playback parties. And we invited everyone in New York that had anything to do with writing a music column to come.
Brilliant.
And we had about 50 people that showed up. We did it in the studio at Studio B on 49 East 52nd Street, right next to the Arthur Godfrey studio. And we played the record. And the response was very positive. And after that, Laura signed a $4 million deal with Columbia. She got $2 million, David got $2 million, and I got fired.
Wow.
And I got fired because back then you could make an
Wow.
album with an artist back then for about $12,000-$14,000. A pop album back then was running maybe 20. At $38,000, I got called in by Business Affairs saying, "What are you doing?"
Wow.
So I said, "I'm trying to make history." And the legal department says, "We don't make history, we make money."
Wow.
I finished the record and the pink slip came.
Wow. The price of art,
Yeah,
basically.
I learned very quickly, you don't make art anymore, Calello.
You couldn't help it.
Yeah, no, that was,
Okay. Speaking of making art, and an interesting album, I'm going to throw the name Frank Sinatra out, and a fascinating project, which I'm curious how it came to pass. It's the album Watertown.
in '68, Frankie Valli was opening for Frank Sinatra. Four Seasons were opening for Sinatra. And Frankie is a very personal person. He got to be real tight with Sinatra. And Sinatra was looking to do a record that was going to be a little more contemporary. And he was one of the first people to do concept records. Come Fly With Me, Come Dance With Me,
Sure.
Only the Lonely. You look at the records that he made, he had similarities. He always picked a thematic pattern to what the record was. And he would record these kind of records. So he was looking to make a more contemporary pop record, and Bob Gaudio wrote the songs. So while Gaudio was the producer, he hires me to write the arrangements. What was really cool about that was when I was 18 years old, this is before I went to work with the Four Lovers, the singer in my band was friends with Tony Bennett's manager at the time.
Okay.
And Tony was recording a record at Columbia with Count Basie. And he said, "Charlie," he says, Dee Anthony was the manager. He says, "Dee invited me to the session. Would you like to go?" Well,
Right.
that's like asking an Italian if he likes pasta, you know. So what happened was I go to the studio and I sat in a little corner and I watched Mitch Miller produce that record. I sat there looking at the conductor conducting the band, and I said in my brain, that's what I want to do. 11 years later, I was in that studio recording Frank Sinatra.
Wow.
Same studio.
Wow. That's wild. And the album itself, you know, it's interesting because looking back on it years later, the critics comment what a brilliant record it was. But at the time, was the audience not quite ready for Sinatra to go where he went, or it was an interesting thing with that record?
The record never took off because his fan base at that particular time was buying the Cool Sinatra.
Yeah, interesting.
And taking into consideration that the songs were contemporary, but they were contemporary in a way that would, for example, I heard recently that Jake Holmes was responsible for influencing Led Zeppelin.
Very much, yeah.
And when you take into consideration that Jake was one of the writers influencing that audience, for him to be able to influence an audience that would be more sophisticated or older didn't seem to be something that would be an easy transition.
Yeah.
So I believe the lack of recognition for the record was based on the Sinatra audience didn't buy it. But yet later on, people that became familiar with Sinatra later on were able to accept the record because they were not into the cool Frank Sinatra. They were only into the music.
Yeah, the record was essentially ahead of its time.
Right.
Jake Holmes was the co-writer on the album. And for those of you, Jake Holmes wrote this piece of music that was called Dazed and Confused, which Led Zeppelin had on their first album. And it was, you know,
I
major.
never expected him to show up at the studio. Because back then, sometimes the artist wouldn't show up, we'd track. 7 o'clock, I get up on a podium, the audience is, the orchestra's there, tap on a stand. I said, okay, guys, 7 o'clock, let's, I put the name of the song, Bring Down My Hands. We're running down the arrangement. About halfway through the arrangement, there's a tap on my leg. And I was on a podium that was about this high. There's a tap on my leg. I turned to look, and there's Frank Sinatra. He looks at me and says, "You Calello?" I had never met him. And I went to say hello to him, and nothing came out of my mouth. I said, what have you gotten yourself into? In my brain, I'm saying, oh my God, he's here. He's going to hate this. and all the negativity that the frustrating, the insecurities, it was amazing as to the feeling. And what was really funny about it, after I went into the control room, after that, and he came up to me, he says, "Nice chart."
Wow.
Then I felt relaxed.
Sure, yeah.
But I don't know, I guess because as an arranger, you get to see a different side of people. He was a very soulful guy, very, very soulful guy. There's some funny memories. I was recording him once at Media Sound on 57th Street. We were doing a Paul Anka song, and he evidently didn't have really enough time to learn the song, so he was sort of learning it as we were recording it. So he wasn't singing the song quite like the melody. So I went to press the talk back, and I said, "I can't do that. That's Frank's. No, that's my job." So I pressed the talk back. I said, "Frank, let me play this back for you." So we rolled the tape back, and I walk into the control room. I walk into the studio. He's standing in front of the mic. And I said, and as I walk in, he's listening to the playback, and he goes, "Okay, wise guy, I hear it. Yeah, he was, and one of the great parts about it, about the session was he came in, he says, "Is there anything you need, from the vocal performance?" So I said, "Well, give me one more pass at it. Just this line over here. I don't think we have this line yet." So he said to me, "Well, is there anything you really want out of it?" I said, "No, just, I want you to know that I need that line." If I could have explained to him what I wanted, I would have never gotten what he gave me. He sang that line. It was like, you couldn't believe the way he interpreted the one line and how he was able to make magic. He'd sing, the only thing you would hear, you'd hear just his voice. Just an amazingly, brilliantly gifted singer.
Yeah. And apparently knew his way around the studio as well.
Yeah.
In terms of engineering, moving things around.
He knew more about me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean
No.
He knew more about me before he came to the studio than I thought. He was an avid reader. He would go into town. He'd read newspapers from cover to cover. He'd read books. He'd read all the trade magazines.
Yeah. He's a lot more aware than people thought he was.
He was responsible for his own career. He used to sit with the arrangers and say, "I want this, I want that, I want this." Then he'd give them a free hand. Then he'd go into the studio, and he would basically know what to expect because he was doing the groundwork.
Sure. What was the most of the hit songs? Are there pieces that took the most work? You mentioned the Streisand piece. Were there things that you put something together, you went in the studio, and then you just shook your head and said, Yeah, back to the old drawing board. Things that took some edits.
Um, well, making the Four Seasons records was a combination. I'd write an arrangement, and I'd get to the studio, and Bob would hear the arrangement, and like there would be something in the arrangement. He'd say, "Stop! So we're going to start the record with this." So he'd take something I wrote and he'd put it, and I'd watch Bob, and although I'm titled an arranger, my job was I became a record maker. I made records. I used the arranging as a tool to make records. But Bob taught me something about making records. He was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. He taught me the element of the bizarre. Where he would find something that none of us would think would actually work as the intro, and or do something like Walk Like a Man. He walked around the studio, stamping his feet on the parquet floor. Here, set the mic here. There were 4 boards that were loose. We're going to stamp. We're going to walk like a man, and we recorded foot stomps.
And the result was amazing.
It just what he would, who would think of that?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, boy, maybe we need to fix 3 notes on the bass. He's thinking about making a record, and that's really what when I think about things that we changed. I learned a lot about not sticking to the ink, but make the record.
Sure.
You need to move this, fix that. You need to change that. This isn't working. Make this work.
Now, getting out of the recording studio, you became the principal arranger and the assistant conductor of the Florida Symphonic Pops
Right.
in Boca Raton. They became the Sunshine Pops Orchestra. What type of work did you do at the Pops? And you brought, obviously, a pop rock music sensibility into that arena. How does that influence working with an orchestra like that?
Well, it wasn't my idea to do that. It was my wife's. After I was the music director on the Ray Charles 50 Years in Show Business television show, I said to her, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Wow.
And I was 54 years old. I saw the record business changing, and I said, I just don't want to do this anymore. And I said, we should leave California. And she and I decided to go to Florida. I didn't want to live where it was cold. And I got to say, she's a lot smarter than I am in many respects. And she was the one that sent a letter to the Pops Orchestra donating my services before we arrived. Okay? So we get to Florida, and I'm on the beach. I read this great book. Oh, this is great. Oh, I love this. I could write a book. It's like, this is not a big deal. So after 3-4 months of not doing anything, she said, we're going to take a ride. We're going to go to Boca. We were living in Fort Lauderdale at the time. And we go to the Boca Pops. She says, I want to stop in and see these people. So we walk in, and she said, hi, my name is Clay Calello. This is my husband, Charles. Close the door. Don't let them leave.
You were kidnapped by the Sunshine.
So I started to write for them. And as I was writing for them, I realized that there was a whole other world out there other than making records. By that time, rap had started, and I could see that my career as making hit records sort of had run its course.
Right.
Although I still knew that I could make records, the language had changed. Every generation had its own. While I was speaking the language, everything was cool. I recorded Ariana Grande when she was 12. I wrote my first arrangement for her when she was 7. And my wife and I helped her get her first agent.
Wow.
So we were still able to recognize talent and what
Sure.
to do with it. But the fact is that we knew that the language had changed.
Yeah.
If I were to take somebody into the studio right now and try to make a pop record, yeah, I could make it, but it would not be from here. And if it doesn't come from here, it's not going to reach the public.
It's not gonna translate.
So when I got there, one of the things that I knew eventually I would have to do is I would have had to conduct the orchestra. And Richard Heyman, who wrote for Arthur Fiedler, he was the one who wrote the arrangements for Fiedler. He became the principal conductor and replaced Fiedler when Fiedler got sick. Because Richard had written all the arrangements, he said to Richard, he said, "You're going to have to take over the orchestra." He says, "I don't know anything about it." He says, "You wrote all the arrangements." He says, "They're going to listen to you." So I said to myself, well, maybe because I wrote the arrangements, they will listen to me. So I got in front of the orchestra and I said, "Boy," I said, this is really a rush. Doing live concerts is really a lot of fun.
That's great. And that translates a little bit into what you're currently doing, which you'll be doing, tomorrow night as of this recording.
Yeah.
But you've also released a book. You talked about being an author. And the book is called Another Season, The Memoirs of Charlie, you have it as Charlie Calello in the book here. Of Charlie
In New
Calello.
Jersey, they call me Charlie.
There you go.
It's, hey, Charlie.
And you're also doing performances now with, conducting and playing medleys of the hits and things like that. So let folks know a little bit what the current project is that you're out doing.
Well, tomorrow night, we're going to be at Adelphia, at Adelphi, Performing Arts Center, and we have a show we do where I tell stories like this about some of the hits, how they came about, who sang them, what it was like to be in the studio, but also I have two great singers that are brilliant. When I say brilliant, they're brilliant. And I perform the records with the original arrangements. Now, tomorrow, I have a very big surprise. One of the artists that I had a hit record with is going to be there and is going to come up on a stage, and we're going to do the hit record together.
That's
now,
great.
we did it one other time many years ago, but I'm not going to tell you who it is.
I'll tell you, he's still got it. That I will say. So
But it's going to be fun.
That's
But
great.
but the cool part about doing the show, it lets me relive making the hit records without the drama.
Yeah, sure. In your own terms, in your own
Right.
space. I'm going to toss out a few just general kind of music-related questions. Then we'll get to the Dirty Dozen, then we'll take some audience questions. What would you consider to be the elements that make up the perfect song?
The elements to make a perfect song. Well, let's take the song Satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. No, no, no satisfaction. But I try, but I can't get no satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. So obviously it's not the lyric. Now, we see rap music has become quite successful. I once heard one of my colleagues refer to why rap was invented. He said pop music was invented for singers. Rock and roll was invented for people who could sing a little bit. Rap was invented for people who can't sing at all. So when you take a look at what makes a great song, that's an individual taste kind of answer. What appeals to me may not appeal to somebody else. But I always felt that what a hit song was, if it moved me, if it reached my heart, and I felt it in my gut, well, you may not like it, but he would like it. She may not like it, but she would like it. Because feelings are feelings. And basically, we all know love, we all know hate, we all know anger, we all know these basic feelings. And something about the song made you feel good.
Yeah. That's taking away limits of all time and space. Is there anyone that you would have liked to either have seen at work, been a fly on the wall, or have actually worked with?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I would have had time to work with anybody else.
A busy plate. Full plate. Okay.
I had, I went to see Sinatra when he was doing a duet, doing concerts with Dean Martin. And he was working, I think, in Westchester, and I went there. And Dorothy came and got me out of the audience before the show and says, the boss wants to see you. And he took me, I went back to the dressing room, and Frank opened the door. There were about 20 people in the room, and he gave me a hug, which, you know, he said, who's that guy he's hugging? He said, hey, some arranger, some, I think. So then he brings me into this room that was next to the dressing room. There was Dean Martin. And here's Frank talking to Dean. Dean, you should get this guy Calello to do your records. Now, this is Sinatra hyping me to Dean Martin. I'm saying to myself, nobody in the world is going to believe this, that he's trying to sell me to I would have loved to record Dean.
With
that
Dean.
would have been, but I did record his daughter.
Oh, okay. Okay. How do you hope 100 years from now that you will be remembered? Completing the sentence, once upon a time, there was a gentleman named Charles Calello, and he
Was a nice guy.
There you go. That's beautiful. They will often say that when you do what you love, it isn't work. But you mentioned some things about the industry, the drama. But what is it for you that sometimes was turning it into work?
Well, when I write, and I never understood this about myself until my wife called it to my attention one day when she came into my room and says, Charles, I'm going out, and I'll be back in an hour. And she was gone for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I yelled her name out, and she wasn't there. And I realized that when she was talking to me, I never heard her. So she recognized it, and then she would come up and say, Charles. She'd grab me, shake me. Charles, hello in there. I'm leaving, I'm going out. The thing about writing is writing takes me to a zone that there's no reality. It's only the reality in my head. When I get in that zone, I don't understand time. I don't get hungry. I just work. I just love doing what I do. So to me, it was never anything. Once I started to write, no matter what we had to put up with to get to the writing, it was all worth it to get to this.
To get to that point. And obviously to then, as you said here, that finished piece on the radio.
Yeah.
Which must be an amazing feeling. Was there a song that surprised you the most of your work? Was there something that it became a hit record that you said, I wouldn't have expected that to really take off?
I don't really think that that ever became an issue, because when I finished the record, I felt I did my best.
Sure.
And when I did my best, I figured that if it got the right promotion, if the song was really a good song, if it was really performed well, it was well made, somebody would like it.
Sure.
Some of the records that we made didn't become successful because they just maybe weren't exposed.
Yes.
But one of the things you learn about hit records, you have to have the song, you have to have the artist, you have to have the record, you have to have the promotion, you have to have the people that run around to the radio stations, you have to have the disc jockeys believe it. There's all these elements that have to come into play for the record to really be successful. So if a record became successful, I knew it was a good record. It wasn't surprising.
Right, right. Just meant that the dominoes had all been in order.
Yeah.
Well, are you still now discovering music, new or old, that moves you?
I still write. In fact, I wrote yesterday before I got on a plane. I still record people. Of course, the kind of music I do right now is the kind I love: big band string records, where I get a chance to work with really talented people. And as far as doing doing this and making music, I'll probably be in the hospital where they're saying, you know, he's only got moments to live. And I'd be saying, I should have changed the bridge. Or I should have changed the chords. I'd have been thinking about the chords I should have changed because I didn't hit the right chord or something.
Well, in just a few minutes, we will go over to a few audience questions, but I'm going to hit you with what we call the down and dirty dozen. This is James Lipton does it as the 10. Bernard Pafot did them before Lipton. First responses that come to your mind for the following. So here we go. What is your favorite word?
Hit.
What is your least favorite word?
Bomb.
What turns you on?
My wife.
There you go. What turns you off?
My ex-wife.
What sound or noise do you love?
Great sax section.
Yeah. Who is your favorite fictional hero?
I don't know.
Okay. Who's your favorite non-fictional hero?
I'd have to say Don Costa.
Okay. Let folks know who Don Costa is.
Don Costa is an arranger, and he was the guitar player on the Ted Steele show. I don't know, some of you may remember the Ted Steele show. My cousin, Sonny, was the lead singer on that show. But Don was a brilliant arranger. He arranged My Way. He did the Sinatra and Strings record. But to me, Don was the greatest arranger that ever lived.
Brilliant. What sound or noise do you hate?
The scratching on a blackboard.
What makes you want to swear?
I never swear. They will never speak badly of you if you never use foul language.
Beautiful. What profession other than yours would you like to undertake?
What I enjoy doing is I enjoy working with my hands. Whenever I'm not working, if I go out and I work in a garden, or if I build something for the house, it takes my mind away from it, and my mind goes into la-la land, which is similar to writing arrangements.
Sure. What profession other than yours would you absolutely not want to undertake?
An agent.
And finally, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear St. Peter say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
What are you doing here?
Brilliant. Thank you. That was beautiful. And with that in mind, we have our broadcast still happening, and we're going to take some audience questions. If anyone has a question, I'll ask. I'll repeat it for you. Question is, how was it working with Lou Christie?
Lou was great to work with. How we made those records was he wrote with a girl by the name of Twyla Herbert. He'd bring the songs to New York, and we'd sit around a piano with the group called the Angels. They had the hit record, My Boyfriend's Back. Lou just was a delight to work with, very easy to get along with, a wonderful singer. He still sounds the same today. He's really, really, really great. Tomorrow, you may find out if he still can sing.
Down front here, Mike.
I did produce many of the records that I made. I produced After the Lovin', co-produced. My Heart Belongs to Me, I co-produced. I produced The Name Game, the Shirley Ellis record. I produced The Lightning Strikes. I produced the Laura Nero Eli record. I produced a lot of records. One of the things that took me out of producing was the fact that it took a lot of time. And I had 4 kids, and I gave up producing mostly because it just took up so much time that you were busy all the time. It's really like someone who doesn't have a life could really be in a much better position than a guy like me that had responsibilities.
Questions? Back there?
I have a question. I just a reflection. In the spring of '77, I went up to the Westchester Theater
for the sake of our listeners, I'll repeat the question. Gentleman was asking, when songwriter comes in, writes a song, and it gets played, they receive royalty rates on the song. When you come in and make your contribution, do you see benefits from that, what you contribute?
Well, I'm going to answer, I'm just going to make a comment about the first part of it. In '77, that was the time I went to see Sinatra when he introduced me to Dean Martin. So at that particular time, that was about the right time. The other thing is, arrangers traditionally were a work for hire. And in the beginning, when I started my career as an arranger, it was a work for hire. But as a result of us making the records and then becoming independent, we were in a position to ultimately get to the point where we can produce. And if we produced them, then we were able to receive royalties on the records. But mostly, we were a work for hire, a very expensive work for hire.
Back there? Question was, did you have a favorite performer that you liked working with, and if so, who?
Actually, there were a couple of people. When you're working on a record, they become your best friend. And while you're working on a project, you get to really like people. The person I really liked working with the most was Roberto Carlos. Now, you may not know who he is, but he's the biggest singer in Brazil. He not only wrote his songs, but he sang them, and he is beloved throughout the country. His passion, his love, his sensitivity, just to be around that was just magnificent.
Any additional questions back there? Question was, it sounds like when you're writing, it's almost like you're in a state of meditation. Do you sort of feel that?
Well, when you meditate, you're really thinking deeply about what it is that you're doing. So you can say that it's a form of meditation, to meditate on what you're doing, to be able to highlight and bring the ingredients out of it that you actually were concentrating on. So as far as meditating, I know that there's several different forms of meditation, but my view of meditation would be to really look seriously and try to get the depth of what it was. And from that standpoint, yes, I would say it was meditation.
Music to its core. Any other questions? All right. Well, I want to thank our very special guest, Mr. Charles Calello, for joining us today. I want to thank all of our listeners and all of our viewers, on YouTube Live. And we will be having a drawing for tickets to tomorrow afternoon's event. So thank you all for coming out, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.